And now it becomes clear that my plan here is not going to be too effective. Welcome to another episode of my Road to Rapid Top 1000 series, in which I play rapid games with the time control 15 minutes and 10 seconds increment in the hopes of reaching the top 1000 leaderboard on chess.com. Now, I haven't done one of these in quite a while, as to be honest, the quality of my games has not been great, and I've been in a bit of a slump, but I'm trying to stay somewhat consistent with the series, so I'm back with hopefully a pretty instructive video. So, in this game I opened with e4 against my Spanish opponent, and he went for c5. And now I went for c3, the Lappin variation, which I know next to nothing about, but I've been pretty sick of playing against the Sicilian lately, and I thought that with this opening I could kind of transposition into the French. But the problem with my thinking is that I was relying very heavily on my opponent making a certain move, e6, after which I was preparing to play d4, and after d5 and e5 we would have essentially an advanced French. But apparently I forgot that my opponent does not have to play into my plan, and he played d5 here. Arguably the strongest move. Now, I could have taken, but instead I played e5 anyway. He played knight c6 attacking the pawn, and I played d4 defending. And again, if he had played e6 here, we would have basically a French setup, but instead he took on d4, and after I took, he played bishop f5, a very good move. Because in the French, what usually happens is after you play e6, bishop kind of gets trapped on c8 and idles on the queen side, hoping to get some kind of play. But here it's very active on an entirely open diagonal. And this is essentially now an advanced Caro-Kann, which is a lot more favorable for black. If you're ever on the white side of this, you can't expect to get much of an advantage out of the opening. And so I already realized that things are not really great here. So I just tried to continue with knight f3, and he played e6. And so I played knight c3, just developing, and he played bishop b4, creating a pin against my knight. And now already I realize that this bishop is going to be very strong. I need to get rid of it. So I played bishop d3, looking to trade off. And so he took, and I took, and already I can breathe sort of a sigh of relief. He doesn't have this monster bishop on this long diagonal. And so he plays knight to e7, and I just castled, getting out of this pin by the bishop. And at this point we're essentially transitioning into the middle game, and I need to start to think of a plan. And here I was expecting that my opponent would castle short, as would be expected in this position, in which I was preparing to create some kind of a kingside attack by maybe moving the f-pawn forward, developing the bishop at some point. But instead my opponent kind of surprised me by playing queen to d7. And I think he's making his intention pretty clear. He wants to castle long here, which looks kind of strange because the c-file is almost completely open, meaning that his king might be in some danger early on. But this would only be the case if I pounce immediately, and what I should have done here was played a3, attacking his bishop, and if he were to take my knight, I would just recapture the queen, and then I can play b4, b5, and already start to storm the queen side. Or I could have played something like knight to e2, just getting the knight out of the way, and leaving his bishop kind of vulnerable. If he were to castle here, again, I could play a3, and force his bishop back with tempo, and this would be pretty good for me. I can then play something like bishop e3, and get the rook involved, start pushing these pawns, and I'm going to be the first one to attack. Instead, however, I came up with a plan that is not really applicable in this position. I played knight to h4, which even just looks like a weird move because I'm putting the knight on the side of the board where it's not really doing anything. But my idea was to play f4 and then f5 and kind of expand on the king side. But my opponent just castled, and now it becomes clear that my plan here is not going to be too effective because there's really not much to attack. His king is now on the opposite side of the board. The most I could hope to do is like kind of weaken his structure. And so I played bishop e3, looking to just complete my development of the bishop, and he played knight to g6, kind of asking my knight what he's doing here. And if I were to take, it would only help him because he's able to recapture the h-pawn, and he now has an open rook on the h-file. So instead I played bishop to g5, defending my knight while attacking the rook. But again, he just moved out of the way, and now if we look at this, what the hell are these two pieces doing over here? They're really not in the game, and they're just a liability, if anything. What I should have, again, done is probably taken and then brought the bishop back, but I played a3, attacking his bishop. He took. I took with the queen. He played king to b8, a sort of prophylactic move, just getting the king out of the way of the queen. And now I played b4, looking to expand on the queen side, but where are my rest of my pieces to help out? he played f6. Now attacking the bishop, and we see the problem is if the bishop moves back, it leaves the knight hanging. And if I take the knight, then again, he takes here and the rook is open. So in a kind of a tough situation, I just took the pawn, and he took, and now I took the knight. And now he obviously has to take the knight because otherwise it'll take the rook. So he takes, and now I bring the bishop back with check. So it looks like I kind of escaped, not such a good setup on the king side, but the problem is he has some actually pretty good pawns here, and his rook is very active. If I'm not precise here, he might be first to attack me. And so he moves his king out of the way of the check. And now here what I probably should have done was brought a rook into the attack, maybe by rook c1 or rook b1, just lining up the rooks, preparing to invade. But I was a little anxious to get going, so I played b5, which looks like a good move. It attacks his knight, but the knight just goes back to e7 from where it can reroute to a more active position anyway. And now I played a4. And I was thinking that if I can get these pawns up the board quickly and try to infiltrate the structure around the king, I can get a good attack and maybe win before he can get a chance to attack me. But he now plays g5, attacking my bishop, and I retreated to g3, although when I went back and analyzed the game, it appears that bishop c7 would have actually been a quite interesting move. It kind of plants the bishop in black's camp, and it's very hard for him to remove. If he tries to play rook to c8, I can just defend it with rook to c1 and then advance the pawns. But the other move he could have tried here is knight to f5. And this is actually very devious. If I were to try to play queen to a5 with the idea to play bishop b6 and checkmate him on a7, he could then take the pawn. And if I play bishop b6 here, believe it or not, this loses instantly to a very nice sequence for black. Pause and see if you can find it. And the sequence that wins here is knight to e2 check, king to h1 only move, and now rook takes h2. Sacrificing the rook, I have to take it, and now queen to h7 would be checkmate. So unfortunately in this position, my attack just would have been too slow, pretty much regardless of what I was doing. And then played knight to f5. The knight is now attacking my bishop and also putting pressure on this isolated pawn over here on d4, which, as you're going to see, is going to become a huge liability. And so I just continued by playing rook b1, but the problem is my attack is just coming way too slow. He now plays rook to c8, attacking my queen, and like I said, the pawn is very weak. The queen has to stay tight to it to protect, and so I played queen to d2. And now he comes in with rook to c4, infiltrating. Hard for me to defend when my rooks are kind of out of position. So I tried rook to b4, looking to get rid of his very powerful rook, but it doesn't stop him from taking on d4 with his knight. And after I take, he takes, and I'm simply down a pawn, and still he has a very powerful knight in the center of the board. And already there's a very devious trap here. If I'm not careful and play a careless move like a5, I lose on the spot to a nice little tactic, knight to f3 check. And not only is it attacking my king, but it's a discovered attack against my queen. And after pawn takes knight, queen takes queen, game over. So I defended against this by playing rook to d1, making sure that if he tries something like this, my queen is going to be defended, but he just plays e5, cementing the knight's position, and I played king to h1, just making sure that the king is never attacked easily with check. But he just brings his rook over, looking to just push this past pawn, and it's very hard to stop. I tried by playing queen to c3, but he just played queen to d5. He's slowly improving, getting his pieces into better positions. And now I had less than a minute on the clock, and it's very unclear on how I can make any kind of progress or even create any counterplay. I tried rook to d2, but this is just a very bad move because he now plays queen to e4, threatening a back rank mate. So I tried to give the king some space by playing h3, but now after queen to e1 check, king to h2, he has a dagger move to finish me off here. Knight to e2. This is such a strong move. It first of all attacks the queen, but second of all threatens queen to g1 mate. And how do you defend against this? Well, you don't. And I resign on the spot here. Clearly something went wrong, and as we saw, I picked the wrong plan earlier on. If I had not decided to play knight h4 and do some useless stuff on the king side and had immediately focused on the queen side, I actually would have been ahead and would have been the favorite to create a successful attack, but instead I fell behind and it really cost me the game here. So definitely not a great game on my part, but I think the biggest takeaway here is that you have to create the right kind of plan, a plan that is applicable in a certain position, might not be applicable if your opponent makes a different decision, such as in this position when my opponent on move 10 played queen to d7 and then castled long, and I was still planning to attack on the king side, which really didn't make a whole lot of sense. So you got to pick the right plan and do it in a timely manner, otherwise your opponent is just going to have the edge and is going to be able to attack faster than you will. So this concludes episode 10 of Road to Rapid Top 1000. I'm still hovering somewhere around the top 4,000 Rapid players, and I haven't been making great progress recently, but I'm always just a few wins away from moving up the table.